It's my great pleasure to be here with you and hear all this amazing research. I'm learning a lot from all these papers. I will actually read my paper because that's probably the only way for me to keep the time limit, so I apologize for that. So my paper is an attempt to remember, describe, and interpret how the performance history was and is done in Eastern Central Europe through research, interpretation, and exhibiting. I was part of this process, as you might know. In 1997, I wrote a first complex history of Czech performance art as my diploma thesis. It was published as a book, Akční umění, it's the one on the left, in 1999 in a small publishing house. 10 years later, it was reprinted. And in 2015, it was translated into English, and that's the book Marika so kindly referred to. I would like to shortly talk about the process which led to this, and which I believe is one of the examples how the history of performance was conceived in Eastern and Central Europe. To make it more understandable, I propose 4 different stages of this performance history doing. My presentation is going to be naturally based mostly on Czech sources and my personal research experience, but I assume that with some exceptions, it applies in the main characteristic on number of other countries of former Eastern Bloc. The first phase I see as the witness stage. The history of performance art was written then by a number of its participants, direct witnesses, and often friends of performance artists. They were art historians, theoreticians, philosophers, members of progressive art scenes of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Prague, Bratislava, Wrocław, Budapest, Brno, Warsaw, Belgrade, Zagreb, Ljubljana, and many, many others. They were present at different venues, and they referred on them in their writing. One example can be meeting of Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian artists organized by László Beke in Balaton Goglár in 1972. As we can see on the picture on the right, there was a number of artists, but theoreticians as well. Those are the names around that image. For example, László Beke or Jiří Valoch, they were both leading theoreticians of performance art in their countries. On other pictures, we can see, for example, Helena Kontová here on the bottom, in Prague with Petr Štember, Jan Mlčoch, and Karel Miller, or Alex Mlynarczyk with Pierre Restany and Slovak theoretician Radislav Matuštík in Paris. Other images show Jindřich Chalupecký at one of the happenings of Aktuál group on the right, or witnesses of performances by Jiří Kovanda or Karel Miller. We can see leading Czech theoreticians and art historians there, for example, Karel Miller, Milena Slavická, or Jana and Jiří Ševčík. First phase of interpretation of performance was often narrowly focused on one personality or one series of performance. It was drawn from closest nest, it was up-to-date, often very provocative, considering the other art history context of the time. It was published in alternative media of the second unofficial culture sphere. But the writing of these art historian witnesses is very important source of the second phase. The second stage started in the 1990s, after the fall of the wall. Writing of performance art history was part of the enormous effort to rewrite, to reconstruct post-war art history of countries of former Eastern Bloc. A consistent history of performance art didn't exist in this territory. Any scholar interested in the topic had to undergo extensive research through existing articles and publication, often of samizdat nature. It is necessary to say that it was mostly done within the existing national borders. The territory was mostly closed to the international scholars because of the language barrier. So you can see some of the publications I actually worked with in the beginning of my research. Due to the lack of printed documents and texts, with no institutional support and background, it was necessary to seek the artists themselves, find the way to their private archives, listen to their stories. This was investigators, I call it investigator stage. The success of the research often depended on the fact whether the artists kept meticulous documentation, despite nobody being interested in their work, sometimes for decades. It depended on artists' memory, on the willingness to share it, on their personal preferences. All problems of oral history were present. I was part of this exciting process, and it happened to me a number of times that artists refused to talk to me about the performance they did in 1970s because it was over for them. We have to understand that most performance artists in the East created their works in isolation, not only in isolation from art in the West, but also from the public at large, to whom it was, with the rare exceptions, prohibited to freely present. Performance art was for most of these artists a kind of a hobby, usually done in their spare time outside art institution at their own expense. Some of them had amazing personal archives, some of them had nothing. It was lost, taken by police, destroyed. When my first book on Czech action art was published in 1999, Jiří Valoch wrote in its epilogue, "All permanent expositions of modern art in Czech lands have one thing in common. They pretend that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Czech art was represented by more or less adequate paintings, sculptures, or drawings. In this way, they were able to give an impression to the normal public that nothing else really existed. And some theoreticians, either from the conviction or from opportunism, would agree. In the Czech lands, intermedia, beginning with visual and phonic poetry and ending with events, happenings, and the performances that are logically linked to them, as well as actions in nature and dematerialized conceptual works, still appear only rarely in established art museums, and preferably not at all. If we compare random selection of the publications from before and after 2000, we can notice radical increase of English translated or written books. It just shows how quickly the situation changed from the 1990s, when this territory was basically undiscovered, to the 2000. Around 2000, we can also notice the institutional shift. In some of the permanent collections, performance art appeared in the form of documentation. The first studios focusing on conceptual art, including performance, were opened at progressive academies of fine arts in the former Eastern Bloc. Turn of millennium opened the third phase. This shift is apparent when we consider Jiří Kovanda's work and his position. In the early 1990s, Kovanda was still almost exclusively viewed as postmodern painter. He hardly ever spoke of his performance, since he felt like nobody was interested in them. he became an assistant of the painting studio at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague in the second half of the 1990s. But then the situation started to change. He began to create new performances after 2000 and became an international star. His case, I think, beautifully represents this period. It is connected to the so-called documentary turn. This broadly discussed term change discussed change of the theoretical and methodological approach influence the way we look at the performance. Documentation, which during the first two phases was an important player, became suddenly the key issue. Scholars started to examine it vigorously. They for the first time asked who were the photographers and how the final photos were chosen. We can very nicely see it on this example. On the right is the documentation of how Kovanda presented it, but this is actually a scan of the original film, so you can really see that there were so many more images taken of the performance. And the funniest thing is that this untitled performance actually has the subtitle, "I'm waiting for somebody to call me." And you can see on the images that actually the phone call wasn't for him, that he's passing the phone, but of course it was never mentioned anywhere. The myth of photographic documentation has sometimes even become more important than the original action in terms of filling a role within the art world's modus operandi. The original documentation of Jiří Kovanda's action can serve as a good example. Kovanda consistently documented his performances and installations in the 1970s and 80s. He would designate for each a sheet of paper on which he would type the action's title, year, and approximate or precise date. Sometimes he would even provide a short written description of the action. The text would be supplemented by either photographic documentation or a drawing depicting the described situation. But he used single photos as illustration of performances as well. You can see it on the left, excuse me. Today, these sheets of paper, which he once carried around in well-worn folders to show those interested, are viewed as artifacts. Indeed, they possess a certain aesthetic quality since Kovanda conceived them as kind of a collage, and the type text elevates them to another aesthetical level in today's digital age. Yet, they were only records and documents proof that the action took place. In connection with this, I would like to repeat quite funny story. In the late 1990s, Kovanda sent by standard mail his complete documentation from the 1970s and 80s for an exhibition in undisclosed Paris gallery. The gallerist was shocked and called Kovanda on the phone immediately, saying like, "Are you crazy? You sent it just by standard mail without any insurance." And Kovanda replied, "Well, it's just documentation. What's the big deal?" Of course, he wouldn't do that today. I mean, regarding what this costs today. So this presents a dilemma from today's perspective in which the performances documentation possess their own uniqueness. The photographs of the performances essentially from our ideas about this kind of art. The chosen angle, timing, and light work inherently create the tone of the performance for us today. Many of them take the form of petrified spectacles, perhaps of the performance's least important moment. Plus, there are problems with missing documentation. What about the performance which we can rediscover only through oral or written history? Are they less valuable than the ones with perfect visual documentation. Of course, some of the performances, especially from the 1960s, the documentation has absolutely random character. It's not so carefully composed and chose like from the 1970s, and many other problems which I don't have time to open up now. Another thing is, of course, the other types of documentation. Photography is often the only medium that is exhibited on connection with performance art and that works on the art market. Actually, very little film footage of performances exist in Czech action art and in the whole Eastern Bloc. Film and later video cameras were very complicated to get in socialist countries. These were scarce and expensive commodities. But of course, it existed. In our research center, we in 2015 did this compilation of rare film and video footage of the performances of these kind of key authors of Czech action art. And of course, it's possible to work with the documentation also in another way. And I recently participated in another type of research which challenged the documentation through the question of the place. I based it on the question where the performances actually took place. And in 2014, I published a book called Walk Through Action Prague, which was recently translated into English. And in that book, I located all the known performances which took place in Prague from 1949 to 1989. This research was interesting mostly because I really visited almost all the places of the performances in Prague, often accompanied by artists themselves. There I'm on with Jiříko Vanda, trying to really identify the exact spots. You can imagine how difficult it was because some of the places don't even exist now or they are so changed. So it was very interesting to actually observe the social, political, urbanistic situation and how it changed. And of course, standing there and realizing all these differences, it really made me understand better the nature of the original performances. It's kind of a paradox, but it was really amazing. While visiting the places with the artists trying to identify the original spots, I realized how sometimes the original documentation is misleading. I will never forget when Karel Miller showed me the tree on which Stembera spent the fourth night after 3 days without the sleep. I always imagined it as being somewhere outside the city or at least in a big park. How I was surprised when I found it on the garden of a small suburb house. It totally changed my perspective of the action. This research on the role of place in the performance enabled me to formulate new questions and definitely brought new answers. It was very interesting for me because during these walks with the artists, I asked them questions which never occurred to me, or they started spontaneously talk about memories of the actions which they never told me, despite we worked together for basically past 20 years. So it was amazing. But despite these reservations about the documentation role, the documentary turn open new ways of interpretation. And that's even more important, it also opened the field to a number of international scholars who were able to look at the published documentation and derive new interpretations based on it. It also became a material and inspiration for other artists who worked with their own history and heritage of conceptualism. we don't have much time, but I just want to show 3 different examples of reenactment which are part of contemporary Czech art scene. This is Barbora Klímová reacting some of the key performances of 1970s. Or here's the group Rafani reenacting Bianco of 1977, the performance in which Jan Močoch dealt with the Charter 77, these young artists who kind of deal with these political issues from contemporary point of view. Or very interesting reenactment of Kovanda's action by Daniela Baráčková, who actually did it on Times Square in 2006, and she filmed it on a video, which is interesting also how she used already different media, the color, and very interesting is the fact that after 2 minutes she was interrupted by New York police. Which very nicely contrasts with Kovanda, who his action went unnoticed in normalization Czechoslovakia. I will probably leave that issue out to save some time because it's okay, maybe. These experiments could be placed in an international context. Marina Abramović performed her 7 easy pieces at the Guggenheim in 2005, and thus, along with other artists, opened the discussion on the essence of performance. Can it be perceived as musical composition, host reenactment in a new space and time with the participation of new performers and viewers, give it an unrepeatable intensity of experience without restricting it from it being performed again? Or is only the first performance valid, so that each reinterpretation represents a new artwork? Or does it exist only in present, as Peggy Fallon states, and it becomes something different when it is documented or repeatedly represented? How do we retrospectively exhibit these works that are now an iconic part of post-war art history? And this is actually what the question I would like to, the only question I would like to a little bit more develop in the end of my presentation. I want to conclude it with a few examples of exhibitions of performance art. Here is very rare documentation which I found in Karel Miller's archive. It's actually documentation of his first and only solo show, which he had in 1977, shortly before he ended his career as performer, in the apartment of philosopher Petr Rezek. And as you can see on the right, it was really part of the apartment, of the living area, and it was done the simplest way, in large prints of the chosen photographs, each of them representing one of the actions, with small inscriptions typed on a piece of paper, which was glued under the images. It's not so visible on these details, but it was there. It was like in a gallery place there. The exhibition was there only for a week, and it even didn't have much exposure. Just very small circle of friends saw it. That was basically what was possible in Czechoslovakia during this really enlarged repression connected to Charter 77 and these unofficial circles. It kind of contrasts with some exhibitions outside the Czechoslovakia, as you know. Artists from the Eastern and Central Europe were part of expanded network, and they exhibited vigorously around the world. most of the exhibition they took part in, they couldn't see. They just mailed the documentation and it was exhibited. But of course, to the neighboring countries, they could go, and this is one of the examples. It's a Miller, Mlčoch and Stembera exhibition in Galeria Fotomedium in Wrocław. And on the documentation, you can see that actually Karel Miller performed there this untitled performance, which he doesn't even include into his like official documentation. Miller, Mlčoch, and Stembera, they had their first and last retrospective in 1997 in the City Gallery of Prague. And this slide opens the last few examples. So it's a retrospective show of performance art, and I really like the way it was done, because Karel Srb decided that these images were really the documentation. It was an artifact. So he the whole series of photographs just of each of the artists put into a book, and the viewer came into the gallery and could basically like go through the documentation, read it, almost read it. There in the gallery, and of course on a side there were some other documents sort of presented in a more traditional way, as you can see on the right, and of course there is a catalog, but that's it. There was no more presentation. A couple of other Czech artists had these retrospective shows during the 1990s, but it was usually connected to their other work. You know, for example, Knížák would exhibit his actions along with his paintings and design, or Zorka Ságlová would have her performance documentation as a side on her exhibition of her painting. The more interest in exhibiting performance art we can see in latest recent years. This is quite interesting representation of it in new permanent exposition of Moravian Gallery in Brno, which is based, this post-war period is largely based on the archive of Jiří Valoch, which the gallery got to its position, and they even in the exposition included the original cabinet of Jiří Valoch with some of the artifacts inside there. As you might know, Jiří Valoch is really obsessive collector of, and his archive possesses amazing material. So this was actually quite interesting for me, how they worked with it and how they exhibited and just really incorporated into the Czech post-war art history. You can see that they used quite classical way of, you know, like framing the vintage images, and even the captions are done in this kind of a retro style, that it's typewritten on the papers and just kind of placed on the wall. A little bit more classical presentation of performance art was done by Museum Olomouc in 2007, when they presented their also very extensive and interesting collection of performance and conceptual art. It was called Okamžité chrámy. It means instantaneous temples, and it's named after Milan Knížák's series from 1971. You can see just very classical framing of the vintage pictures and documents with normal captions underneath that. Another example is retrospective of Vladimír Havlík, who actually from the 1980s documented a lot of his performances on 8mm camera. So this was exhibition done by Jana Pisaříková in a very small gallery in Blansko. But it was interesting, as you can see, that they just used only the projectors of these very short films, and there was no paper documentation present in the gallery. So those projections were actually quite monumental. So it totally changed the visual impression it gave. And the last example is actually just it's like exhibition which ended in City Gallery of Prague just 1 or 2 months ago. It's a retrospective of Vladimír Ambros, who actually for the first time exhibited his performance work from the 1980s. And it is quite unique because some of his original films were never developed, so there didn't exist any vintage kind of documentation, and that enabled him to really work with the material the contemporary way. And so he enlarged, digitalized these old films and enlarged them on very printed them on totally top quality level, and exhibited them, as you can see, in this like very kind of visually designed way. And again, it was very interesting to see how these images can work in this totally different approach. You had only a small section of kind of an archival material on a side. It wasn't really part of the show. So basically, that's the end of my presentation. I just, with these couple of examples, really open up for the discussion how we can work and exhibit this type of material from today's perspective, and I think it's a huge challenge for many of us. Thank you for your attention.